Mr. Mouse Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, if Al Qaeda is living in Pakistan, killing thousands of citizens within that land, and US cannot intervene because Pakistani governments are actually officially backing up Al Qaeda, and therefore thousands of people are dying in the status quo, then side opposition would say yes to that situation on the grounds of sovereignty and some things like international law or whatnot. We believe that the three things that we are going to do in this debate is quite clear. Number one, we're going to prove to you why this is not an infringement on sovereignty, rather we are actually allowing states to regain sovereignty as a whole. Secondly, we are also going to tell you why our solution is much more effective and side opposition lacks a mechanism in which how they can actually protect people. Finally, we are also going to engage with the final constructive matter coming from South Africa about how we undermine international law. So three questions in this debate. Number one, is this an infringement upon sovereignty? Number two, is this really effective? And finally, about does this undermine international law and what are the impacts if so? So on to our first clash regarding sovereignty and whether this is even an infringement of sovereignty in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Madam Speaker, we told you about a spectrum of countries. We told that various countries exist. Countries that are occupied by the terrorists. Countries that are actually already dismantled. So the issue of sovereignty doesn't even exist in the first place. South Africa doesn't really engage with the issues about we told you about how some countries do not have the issues of sovereignty in the first place because the government is not properly functioning in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. We also told you about states that are explicitly supporting terrorists. However, the one-line response coming from South Africa is two things. Number one, there are better alternatives. And secondly, this doesn't really directly affect the West, so the West shouldn't make the decisions on behalf of such incapable governments. Okay, let's first talk about the alternatives that South Africa provides to us. Number one, note that this is never a direct rebuttal on a principle level why this is actually an infringement, why this is not an infringement upon sovereignty. But the alternatives that South Africa gives us are things like economic support. Okay, Mr. Madam Speaker, we can see that you might have economic support and you might funnel money into these regions. But how does that money actually trickle down to the people in the first place? The countries that we are talking about are the countries where terrorist organizations literally have more power than the governments themselves. The countries that we are actually talking about are regions where these terrorist organizations are so strong that they actually take over all the economic support that comes from external organizations within the country, Mr. Madam Speaker. Their own solution is extremely ineffective. Rather, it is usurped by those terrorist organizations to buy more bombs. When we send charity to Pakistan or Iran, that comes back to us as bombs, Mr. Madam Speaker. Meaning that this is extremely detrimental. Their notion of economic support is simply ludicrous. But then, what actually really is very strange in South Africa's case is that they also talk about, oh, then we can have economic sanctions as well. This gets really strange because if they're going for economic support, we don't think that such alternatives can actually coexist with economic sanctions in the first place. But finally, let's talk about their final alternative, which is fight for territory or like such other like methods of combating terrorism or whatnot. Okay, Mr. Madam Speaker, if they're going to have fights anyways, if you're going to have US military going into the ground anyways, how is the immense amount of... Okay, so even if we concede to the fact that such massive resentment is going to be caused against the US, how is that actually going to be different than the South Africa's world? If you're going to have US soldiers and military competence going into that region, they need to at least provide us a comparative of how their world is actually going to be different from ours, Mr. Madam Speaker. So secondly, let's also talk about how this doesn't affect the West. So the West should not be making the decisions on behalf of these incapable governments. No, thank you, sir. Number one, if you're talking, we think that this debate mainly runs on a comparative. We cannot have an actor that's 100% responsible, nor we can have an actor that's always going to be effective in any single circumstance. Rather, we believe that actors such as the US or the West are much more better in making decisions like this. Why is that? Because number one, the West is actively combating terrorism and is also openly dedicated to the cause of dismantling terrorism as a whole. That is why the West is going to be much more effective than states that openly endorse terrorism and also fund those own states in the first place. Number two, even though we accept the sovereignty exists, when push comes to shove, we think that these nations such as the West should also prioritize their own national security compared to the sovereignty of the countries like Iran. So, at the end of the day, we believe that in the cases of these countries, they're already taken away their sovereignty in the first place because of these terrorist organizations. We actually allow them to regain sovereignty by going into the lands and taking down these terrorist organizations and giving the land back to the people. That's what side proposition does, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's why rather than taking away sovereignty, what we are actually doing is we're giving sovereignty back to those countries that are being intervened as a whole. So onto our second argument, or onto our second clash regarding effectiveness. They told us about how there's a shared cost within these terrorist organizations. So let's talk about the two scenarios that exist under both worlds. Number one, when the terrorist organization fragments, or secondly, when there's going to be a smooth transition. Number one, let's talk about the fragmented organizations. They said that fragmented groups become much more radical. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that this is actually good for us in two main respects. Number one, the fact that the organization becomes much more radical means that it's open to more attacks from the West. That means that more people are engaged in combating with that organization. There's a greater critical mass that's openly opposed and trying to take down that organization as a whole. When ISIS emerged, more people and we think that more countries were actually engaged in taking down that organization as a whole. No, thank you, sir. But number two, we also believe that when a radical group emerges, those groups actually increase the bar to join that organization. Therefore, from the people who are outside the organization, they're much more less likely to support those radical groups as a whole. That's why radical groups do not actually sustain for a long time. Rather, they break down by themselves in an extremely short amount of time. Second, let's talk about the instances where you have a smooth transition. We think that this is also beneficial for our world in mainly two key respects. Number one, if you have a smooth transition, the fact that you have this new leader, we believe that even though there is a smooth transition, that leader is definitely going to have less like knowledge or less know-how in running the organization compared to the previous leader. This means that until that leader gains more experience and develops himself, we earn time to combat the terrorist organization as a whole. That means we can also prepare ourselves better. We can have more collective defense strategies or whatnot. We believe this is actually beneficial for our side. But the comparative, Mr. Madam Speaker, that we can give you is that on their world, on South Africa's world, they actually do not have a mechanism on how all of their alternatives can actually defend people, Mr. Madam Speaker. We told you about how terrorist organizations have a hierarchical structure. We told you about how when the leader is killed, it's extremely likely that the organization fragments as a whole. Even though the leader hides himself, that means that more money is used in order to hide that leader instead of engaging in attacks against the West. That means the terrorist organization actually is decreasing their own power in order to launch more attacks against the West. We believe that actually decreases the capability of the terrorist organization in engaging in more terrorist attacks. Therefore, we believe that killing the head of the terrorist organization is extremely beneficial in the long term. So finally, let's talk about the international laws that side opposition tries to give us. They talk about how we're undermining international law and how this is so much detrimental. Two responses to this, Mr. Madam Speaker. Number one, we believe that international law itself is not stagnant. It is supposed to be flexible, and what we are actually doing is that we are changing this international law so that it is adjusted to the changing circumstances. We believe that according to a changing world, international law should also change, and we are actually doing the same thing, Mr. Madam Speaker. The League of Nations needed unanimous decisions in order to act. After people realized that is extremely ineffective, they changed so that within the Security Council, more than 2/3 of the people have to agree upon a single matter. After the Rwanda genocide, people agreed upon the fact that these security councils are very, very ineffective. That's why we had the R2P intervention. We believe that international law is supposed to change, and what side government is doing in this debate is exactly changing those international law so that it adapts to changing circumstances of terrorism, so that it adapts to how terrorism is evolving within our society, Mr. Madam Speaker. But secondly, even though undermining international law is so much of a detrimental thing, and there's going to be escalations of conflicts or whatnot, we believe that escalation of conflict is inevitable from the moment when you decide to fight a war against terrorism. That's because even inside South Africa's world, if you're going to have those military operations that try to fight back terrorism and regain territory, you're still going to have those escalations of conflicts, Mr. Madam Speaker. If those governments are so much corrupt, and if those governments are so much trying to endorse those terrorism, we believe that those governments also have an incentive to have those to develop their own military personnel in order to move out those Western intervention in the first place. Therefore, we believe that the situation is not actually different in South Africa's world, even though we assume in our worst case scenario. For all these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.